Climate change is the great challenge of our time, already challenging most severely those already poor, for whom, if we do not act, it will deliver devastation. And ours may be the final generation with the opportunity to effectively respond to the now urgent, uncontested effects of climate change. It is now clear that failure to respond to the scientific reality of climate change may ultimately lead to the destruction of life on our planet.
I'd say hugely concerned. It would be something that I'd know of about. I wouldn't be hugely concerned about it, no.
In 2008, I was part of an Arctic expedition sponsored by Ben & Jerry's, which is the ice cream company. And before I went to the Arctic, I knew about climate change, but I thought climate change was happening, when I had grandchildren or great-grandchildren. It wasn't something that was happening now. It was something that would happen in the future. And when I went to the Arctic, I realized that it was happening right then and there. This was back in 2008. So even then, climate change was happening at that moment. And the reason why it was happening so quickly in the Arctic is because the Arctic is this frozen system, and so when you change the temperature even 1 or 2 degrees, that whole frozen landscape melts and turns into a completely different landscape. They call this whole thing the greenhouse effect because basically it operates just like a glass house or a greenhouse. So we get radiation from the sun, goes through the Earth's atmosphere, and then when it hits the Earth's surface, it changes to a different frequency, which means then it can't pass through the atmosphere again. So basically the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, things like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, they trap that heat and they keep the Earth warm and they keep it at a climate that's favorable to life, which is why we're able to grow things and why we have a good quality of life here compared to, say, another planet like Venus, which has way more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and so it's actually much hotter.
We're injecting vast amounts of energy into an essentially closed system. It's accumulating, that energy is accumulating in the system year after year. So it's like a kettle that the lid has been welded on, and we're turning up the furnace. With climate change, we're all in the same boat. And if I can give you an analogy, the global north, which is us, the prosperous part of the world, we're up the dry end of the boat. The global south is on the leaky end of the boat. That's the end of the boat that's tilting into the water. What I mean by that is they're currently experiencing the direct impacts of climate change. But we in the global north are going, well, thank goodness it's not us. The reality is we're all in the same boat, and if the boat founders, we all go down. Maybe the south goes first, but the rest of us go after them. We're messing with systems that we barely understand, and these systems are our life support system.
Take this year as an example, because it maybe kind of confuses people. We've had a lousy summer. It's been cold. It hasn't been summery. July, particularly cold and miserable in most parts of Ireland. It was the warmest month on record in the world globally. It broke all the records. It was the warmest month ever. And this year is going to be the warmest year ever. 2014 was previously the warmest year. Every year it gets warmer. But so the climate's changing.
At the moment we're on a trajectory that will see the world's temperature, global average temperature, increase by more than 2 degrees. And 2 degrees is kind of the consensus that the scientists have agreed on that is manageable within our current systems. So from that perspective, we're going into a bad place.
Unless we turn the heat down, we're going to have really change at a rate, at what's called an exponential rate, and a non-linear climate change. And the big fear among many scientists watching climate change right now is that we could be heading into what are called non-linear tipping points. This is where systems, imagine like a light switch. You go from on to off. Now, if you half press the light switch, it sort of toggles a little bit. But at a certain point, it switches from one position to another. Now, we're currently in a particular equilibrium, a particular climate equilibrium, but it's being pushed out of equilibrium by the injection of billions of tons of greenhouse gases.
All models predict that change will happen, but we don't really know yet and what we have to prepare for. Is it warmer? Is it colder? Is it drier? Is it wetter?
Also, we're likely to see sea level rise. Exactly how much, no uncertain, but their estimates are increasing again as to what that effect might be. So Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Galway, Waterford, all our cities are in threat of higher sea level rises.
We're going to get between 1 and 3 metres of sea level rise this century.
There's more energy in the climate system, so we're going to get more energetic weather. We're going to get more storms. We're going to get more heavy rainfall events in the west of Ireland, probably particularly, and drier events in the east of Ireland. That sounds contradictory, not that too different. The country's not that big, but that's what the best modelling we have says. We're going to get more flooding. We're going to get more extreme events, more storms, more the sort of cyclonic conditions that we saw in recent years.
It's possible to get a switching moment in Earth climate systems, like that light switch, where we go from the climate that humans have thrived in for the last 10,000 years to a climate that may not be compatible with human civilization at all. And it can happen quite suddenly, much more suddenly than most politicians or policymakers have any idea about. The danger is Earth's climate could quite quickly, and about quite quickly, let me put that into numbers, in a 5 to 10 year period, Earth's climate could switch from the very benign 14, 15 degree climate that we have now into something completely different.
It's mostly due to traffic. We don't have a great public transport system.
I'm very surprised with that. I would have thought it would be more kind of, fuel-related products that people are using on a daily basis at home, maybe. I wouldn't have thought agriculture wouldn't have come into it at all.
Animals like cows and sheep are called ruminant animals, which means they have a type of stomach that ruminates, a 4-chambered stomach, and therefore they create a lot of methane gas. And methane is more than 30 times more potent greenhouse gas than something like carbon dioxide. So they're very potent emitters of greenhouse gas, and that's one of the main ways that agriculture or animal-based agriculture impacts climate change. Other ways that agriculture can impact climate change is just through the waste material from animals like cows, which also emit nitrous oxide and emit more methane gas. And then another way that agriculture impacts climate change is through use of fertilizers. So when we put down nitrogen fertilizer on our agricultural products, that can emit nitrous oxide and things like that. So there's a number of ways in which agriculture contributes to climate change.
A very large part of our emissions come from agriculture. Now, if you purely look at agricultural emissions per person that lives in Ireland, we have a very high emissions profile.
Ireland is really unique in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions profile. So most countries, their highest level of emissions comes from the energy sector. But in Ireland, our highest level of emissions comes actually from the agricultural sector, which is higher than either energy or transport. So we're unique. We're the only other country that rivals us in this way is New Zealand.
What isn't widely understood is that agriculture actually globally accounts for a vast amount of the emissions. So for example, here in Ireland, agriculture accounts for over 30% of all our emissions are coming through agriculture. And some estimates say it's actually higher than that. We cannot have a situation where 3, 4, 5 billion humans can all eat meat. How many tens of billions of animals is that going to require? And how much more land do humans plan to clear for our own use? We're already wiping out the rainforests of Indonesia, Borneo and so on, being destroyed at the rate of, somebody described it as 50 football fields per minute of rainforest has been cleared in the last 15 years. Try and imagine that figure. Get a visualise of the size of a field, the size of Croke Park. 50 Croke Parks a minute disappearing for all time, every minute for the last 15 years.
2020, we've set a 20% reduction in emissions, 20% renewable target, and 20% efficiency. For 2050, which is the sort of timescale we have to solve this problem. We're not going to do it in 5 years, but we have to within 40 years, 35, 40 years, we need to be on top of it. And what the European Union has said, and what the leaders, heads of government have said, is that as a union as a whole, we would have an 80% reduction in our emissions by 2050.
We have to all share the burden of reducing emissions. But the pathway that Irish agriculture has chosen is that it has no intention of reducing emissions whatsoever. Therefore, Irish agriculture currently is on track to consume Ireland's entire emissions allowance. The Irish national dairy herd is now on track to expand by adding about another 330,000 cows to expand the herd.
Also an expansion in beef and other areas as well, with a view to probably increasing the production and the value to the economy by about 50% over the next 10 or 15 years.
You can't have infinite growth on a finite and rapidly declining planet. Here's the thing, agriculture is actually quite a small part of our economy, yet it's producing vast amounts of emissions. So how do we square this? And here's the thing, we're going to have to collectively reduce all our emissions.
So it's a tricky situation for us, because if we want to make the most impact on reducing our emissions, it would logically make sense to do something around agriculture. But at the moment we're not, because we think agriculture is important for our economy, and we have a fantastic system that allows for grass-fed livestock rearing. So we haven't really been dealing with how to reduce agricultural emissions.
The agricultural lobby in Ireland argue that we're uniquely efficient in terms of sustainable carbon grass-based food production. In fact, if you look at Ireland in a European chart, we're about in the middle. We're nothing special. We've got no magic ingredient here for producing food any more green than anywhere else. Green in Ireland is largely a marketing slogan. It means almost nothing.
The worst thing that's happening, I think, at the moment in Irish politics when it comes to climate change is that there's a lot of rhetoric. So you could look at what people like Enda Kenny are saying to the UN, and there's a lot of "we care about climate change." And then you look at the behavior that they're exhibiting in Europe, where they're trying to get out of doing anything in relation to climate change, particularly in agriculture. So there's this hypocrisy there of saying they care, but yet doing nothing.
I think the issue with climate change at the moment is that the big money, if you like, is on the other side of the argument. In other words, it's on the side in favour of continuing with the burning of fossil fuels and so on. That's $1 trillion business worldwide. So there's huge interests and vast amounts of capital already tied up in a commitment on the part of large industries to continue burning fossil fuels. So it's also in their interest to invest a fair amount of money in trying to persuade the public and befuddle politicians into believing that climate change isn't an issue. Unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth.
The retailers would also be seen, some of them anyway, to be getting perhaps excessive profits at the expense of farmers.
The government supports the big players, the big agri-food companies. They're the ones who've got the ministerial relationships. They're the ones who are the big shots. And the local artisan producers and organic farmers are considered to be something of a joke.
So there's a lot of things we could be doing around agriculture to reduce emissions, but at the moment it's like the elephant in the room or the cow in the room. We don't tend to deal with it because it upsets a lot of people.
If you take into account that we export 85 to 90% of our food, and that we are feeding effectively 14 million people across Europe and other continents, if you then look at the emissions per person that we're feeding, our footprint of our milk is the lowest in Europe and probably one of the lowest in the world, and the carbon footprint of our beef is the 5th lowest in Europe.
So right now the Irish government and Irish business is really focused on creating infant formula. Chinese mothers want Irish infant formula. But we're taking an incredible product. We're taking grass-fed dairy, which would make the most delicious yogurt and cheese, and we're turning it basically into powdered garbage, essentially. I mean, we're taking all the goodness out of it, all the fat out of it, and turning it into powder because that has a indefinite shelf life. And we're sending it over to China in vast quantities. It's not even a product that we need to survive. I mean, babies can survive just fine and maybe even better on their mother's milk. So we're turning an amazing product into something that's not particularly needed. Ironically, in about the late 1970s, the company Nestle did this in Africa and tried to get infants in Africa to drink baby formula rather than breast milk. And a lot of people to this day still don't buy Nestle products because they were so outraged.
Now we're seeing recently a slowdown in the growth in China, and we'll have to wait and see what the implications of that are. But so far the indications are that that's where the main growth will take place. Also, particularly in infant formula. Most
people in Asia are lactose intolerant. They cannot consume dairy foods. Why? Because they've gone 100 generations without dairy foods. And yet, right now, we're exporting dairy products into these markets and viewing them as that without, considering that in a wider sense.
We actually import 1 ton of food per person per year into this country. So we're heavily dependent on food imports. And given the predictions for future climate, where the rest of Europe is potentially going to be in widespread drought and everything, we're at high risk when it comes to food production because we're so dependent on the outside world for our food. So there are some people here in Ireland who think that because of the forecasts for future climate, particularly in Europe, that we need to be looking at how to feed both Europe and feed the world because the rest of the world will suffer a lot from climate-related impacts and their food production systems could collapse or dramatically decrease. But at the moment in Ireland, we're not even feeding ourselves. So to think we could suddenly feed the 9 billion, given our current system, is a little bit unrealistic. We need to be looking at how we stay food secure. So we're worried about energy security, but we're not particularly focused on food security. So I think rather than looking outside Ireland all the time, we need to be looking inside about how we protect our own systems, feed ourselves, and then look at how do we feed the rest of Europe and potentially the world.
Land can become a limited resource or a limiting resource, and we have to start thinking which part of the landscape are good at delivering which expectations.
We can't live on beef and dairy alone, so we need to be looking at how can we grow more of our own food, how can we make more of our own food. We could make more yogurt and cheese even rather than exporting all of our beef and dairy or turning our dairy into milk powder. We could be creating higher value products that are of more benefit to us here at home in order to protect us from future climate risks.
Often when you mention changing food options, their eyes roll a little bit and they go, we couldn't do that, I love my meat. And there's some truth to that, but the reality is that most people in the world today are vegetarians. Meat eating is the exception, not the norm.
There's a way out of this where it's through really attentive use of land in terms of what grows best where, and what food you grow is a function of what the land is really best for in a really scientific assessment. And I think that's an important analysis because I think it gives Irish farming a sense of responsibility and opportunity and hope that they're actually the real skilled practitioners in climate.
I think that we could do a lot more in terms of local food movement. Right now it's really hard if you're a small producer, a small farmer, and you want to create a high value product, say a yogurt or a cheese. It's very hard for a small producer to create a small little artisan food business. A lot of the regulations and the red tape make that difficult. People need to have separate commercial kitchens to produce food, and that's just an unrealistic investment cost for most households. So we could be doing a lot more to open up local food producers and food markets and trying to keep the system as small and local as possible, so the food isn't being exported or transported huge distances, but rather is being more traded locally and traded at home.
It's not as if we should all of a sudden stop eating potatoes just because it produces CO2. Of course we should. It just should be in a way that is as responsible as possible.
It's not all just thou shalt not ever have a cow in the land again, thou shalt go out of business because we're so fucking angry with, with whatever. It's not that, that's not going to work. But a sense of, listen, I think there's an opportunity here to be responsible and also sustainable economically. That's the message has to go out.
I do firmly believe, as Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, said recently, we're the first generation probably to fully understand climate change and the last generation to be able to do anything about it.
I think we should all do things personally to reduce our impact on climate. So we should try and include more vegetarian meals in our diet and think about our own personal impact. But in reality, the clock is ticking very quickly, climate change is happening, and individual changes in behavior happen very slowly, too slow in fact for us to really make the difference we need to make to stop climate change. So what we need are big system-wide changes. We need to decarbonize our energy system so that we're not dependent on imported fossil fuels, and we also need to really change our agricultural systems in large ways. That can't happen on an individual level. That takes really strong political leadership. We need to make our politicians realize that even though we have all these other more immediate stresses, we're still very concerned about climate change.
On our current trajectory, this isn't going to end well. So we either accept that fact or we get involved in being part of the solution. Now, there are no simple solutions, in case you're wondering, can we fix it? Is there a switch somewhere that we can turn off climate change? No, there isn't. Climate change is the reality for our generation. However, we may not be able to make it a great deal better, but we can certainly prevent it from getting a great deal worse quickly. Climate change is coming, and the question really is, in what time scale, and are we going to prepare to meet it, to challenge it, to try and slow it down, or do we just shrug our shoulders and say, yeah, it'll never happen to me?
They're leaving this to future generations, to our children, to have a quality of life that is way below what we get to enjoy now. So I'd like to see more people out on the streets and more people asking their elected representatives what they're doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland.
You need to get educated about the impacts of the decisions that we make every day as so-called consumers.
When we pollute the atmosphere of fossil fuels such as carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, we disrupt the system in such a way that heat from the sun can get in, but it can't get out. As a result, the climate shifts, resulting in global warming and climate change. Usually when we think of climate change, we imagine cars and smokestacks. These do, of course, contribute considerably to the issue, but they aren't the only culprits. In fact, raising animals for food is one of the most significant sources of these emissions. It has been found that a staggering 51% or more of global greenhouse gas emissions are caused by animal agriculture. Here in Ireland, agriculture is responsible for 32% of our greenhouse gas emissions. This is more than the energy sector at 22% and the entire transport sector at 19%. By the year 2020, we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 20%. However, the plan is to dramatically increase our animal produce by adding 300,000 more cows to the national herd. Clearly, these two goals are incongruent. So why are we doing this? Well, apparently we have a duty to produce more in order to feed the world. But on a finite planet with a population set to hit 10 billion by 2050, is rearing animals for food really the best way of doing this? Globally, we use more land to rear animals than exists on the moon, and this area is growing constantly, as 1 to 2 acres of rainforest are destroyed every second to accommodate animal agriculture. Considering the fact that the same patch of land used to produce 1 quarter-pounder beef burger could be used to grow 53 potatoes, perhaps we need to rethink our land use if we really want to feed the world. But you can do something. Every single day, your food choices can make a huge impact, even if you can't see them right away. As well as cutting your carbon footprint in half, you could save 4,163 litres of water, 45 pounds of grain, and one animal's life.
Actually, probably if you're saying it's coming from, the highest percentage of it is coming from agriculture, yeah, well, maybe if people kind of stood up and said they wouldn't use certain kind of products, well then maybe in that way, yeah. But probably people aren't aware that it's coming from agriculture, so therefore they're not going to make the change unless they're told.
We were talking about a nuclear bomb destroying the world. This is a nuclear bomb in waiting if we do not get to grips with it, and time is running out.
There's an attitude of, doing something about climate change is what we do when the economy is strong. But right now, we need to think about jobs and we need to think about growth, and we don't have time or the luxury to be doing something about climate change. But this isn't a luxury issue.
I hate the phrase consumer. I'm not a consumer, I'm a citizen. We have to stop thinking like consumption machines and start thinking like citizens, that we are responsible for our actions, and we're also responsible to the generation that follows us to leave them with a livable world and to leave them with a reasonable chance to have a reasonable future. We depend on the rest of nature, and if we continue our war on it, well, we'll be one of the major casualties of that war.
But I think it's one that hopefully, if all sectors of the economy and all states in the world play their part, we can reach.